Hello everyone, this is the follow-up lecture for week 7, the lecture on Paul Laurence Dunbar and Charles Chesnutt. So to go over a few points that I saw in your Blackboard posts and your journal posts. So we begin, I asked you guys some questions about stylistic and political differences between Chesnutt and Harper. And I thought you guys had a lot of very interesting answers there. I think it's important to note that both Chesnutt and Harper are using dialect. And Chesnutt was widely known as a master of this process. So Chesnutt wrote not just the short stories that we read in class, but he also wrote 4 different novels as well. And each one of those novels, which are all set in the South, all of his characters are using some form of dialect. And so Chesnutt, his characters, if you compare good dialect writers with bad dialect writers, you get a very significant difference in terms of how they're done. And Chesnutt was definitely a very good dialect writer. Frances Harper was an effective dialect writer, but I think that her writing style is very different from Chesnutt's. Harper is more direct in the kind of political responses that she's looking for in her writing. As I mentioned in my opening lecture, Harper, her primary audience is young African Americans recently after slavery that she finds in the churches that she took her book to sell to those students, to use it as a model. So she wants her readers to read this book and use it towards particular political ends. Chesnutt has a very different reason for his writings. I mean, he is concerned with African American experience and African American politics and their situations, but Chesnutt states explicitly that things he's interested in are artistic craft in a sense. He wants to write stories as good as those written by Joel Chandler Harris. So he's got a different ambition than Harper does. And I think that comes across also in the way he presents the somewhat political or social issues that he addresses. So whereas in Harper's book, the characters have a political goal, and we know that Iola has to go to the South and work for her black community, and her readers are supposed to see Iola in that role. For Chesnutt's characters, if you look at the ending of The Wife of His Youth, Chesnutt leaves us with a sense of what we're supposed to, or what he believes we're supposed to do, but he doesn't answer questions for us. And this gets to the question I asked you guys about the kind of problems that Mr. Ryder and Eliza might feel at the end of the story of The Wife of His Youth. So all of our sympathies are with Mr. Ryder and Eliza coming back together, having been separated for 20 years by slavery. But Chesnutt leaves hanging the questions as to what are the difficulties these two are going to have. Are Eliza and Mr. Ryder, are they at all similar to one another? Is continuing this marriage going to be a fruitful union? Or will it be just a bumpy road that they'll have to travel together? And I'm sure that Chesnutt is suggesting that both of those could possibly be true, that the bumpy road will no doubt have to be worked out somehow, and that he is encouraging us to take that position, but it's still presented in a way that is less decided than is Frances Harper's. So between the two of them, I think that Harper has a more direct political issue, and Chesnutt is a little bit aiming for a different kind of perfection of craft, I think, in Chesnutt's part. Also, I want to talk briefly, make a correction that I saw in some of your posts about the Gooford Grapevine. So the Gooford Grapevine, which is the first story from Chesnutt's Conjure Tales collection, is a whole collection of stories that all have the same framing device. So the framing device for these stories is that there is a white northerner who has come down to the South and has purchased land. And on this land, there is Uncle Julius, who is living on the land, who is formerly a part of the plantation that was there during the era of slavery, but now these stories are being written during the Reconstruction era. The old plantation owner is gone, this new white northerner has bought this southern land, and Uncle Julius, who used to live there, is still around on the land. And the framing device of the story is that Uncle Julius tells stories to the white northern narrator. So we have a story within a story in each one of these cases. And many of you made the incorrect assumption that the speaker throughout the framing device of these stories was also black, was also African American. But in fact, this character is meant to be white. So it's Uncle Julius is telling his stories to a white northerner. And so that opens up some interesting questions about the relationships between blacks and whites in the segregation era, in the period after Reconstruction that Chesnutt is working with. About the question about modern-day blackface, that opened up a lot of discussion. for the most part, everyone seemed to be taking the position that there are no instances where blackface could be sort of salvageable as a modern day kind of form of expression. I think one of you, Sean Tolan, who I want to commend, his blog post brings up some very interesting cases that I think show that there are much more complexities to this issue than I think many of you gave it credit for. There are many instances in contemporary artistic expression where there are characters who dress in blackface in ways that are challenging, that are insightful, and that are being used to dismantle racist thought as opposed to being used to affirm racist thought. Now, blackface instances that are being used to affirm racist thought, those ones that are used to make fun of the person that they're imitating, make fun of black people, well, those instances are always racist. They're always objectionable. But some of the other cases that we talked about in contemporary cinema, for example, like Robert Downey Jr.'s character in Tropic Thunder, or there was one case that I mentioned where there was a show called Louie on HBO, and the character there, his daughter, wanted to dress up as Frederick Douglass because she admired Frederick Douglass. In both of those instances, raise some questions about when is blackface, if not acceptable, if acceptable is too strong of a word to use here, at least being used in some kind of a strategic kind of a manner. And I really do think that perhaps there are some of those instances, and the question needs to be, when are those instances, and what kind of thought, what kind of action do those kind of representations provoke? To turn briefly to Dunbar, a lot of you guys described Dunbar and his poems and said that you were really moved by his poems. I think a lot of your analyses of the poem Sympathy were very interesting. The poem Sympathy, someone did note, is where Maya Angelou's autobiography, I Know Where the Cagebird Sings. Her autobiography gets its title from Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem. So she's reflecting on the things that he says in that poem. One of the questions that I have that I think is worth continuing to explore is that many of you made the assumption, as you talked about the narrator of Sympathy and the narrator for Dunbar's other most famous poem, We Wear the Mask, that the narrator was African American, was black. Many of you said the narrator of Sympathy was a slave. And I think that, well, given that Dunbar writes these poems in the 1890s, when slavery has been over for 30 years almost, and given that Dunbar had this very personally saw this distinction between his dialect verse and his formal verse. Now, his dialect verse is that verse, like the Deserted Plantation, that is written in dialect and that typically shows images of slavery. But Sympathy and We Wear the Mask, neither one of those poems are his dialect poems. So he's writing a more formal verse there. And typically in his more formal verse, he has a more sort of universal narrator. Now, because we know who Dunbar is, and we know that Dunbar himself was African American, living in the 1890s, and facing issues of racism of his own, we can make some assumptions that there are similarities between Dunbar's speaker and the experience that Dunbar has. But in the text of the poem, it's very specific in that it clearly does not state blackness. It doesn't state that the speaker is black or African American. And Dunbar does have other formal verse poems where he does talk about skin color, skin tone. So in these two, notably, he doesn't mention the notion of race, which isn't to say that the characters can't be read as being parallel to or similar to experiences of the black community. But I think that We Wear the Mask in particular has been read by many people of different ethnicities and different groups who see the kind of sentiment expressed in that poem as being applicable to any situation. There are many instances where someone talks about keeping something hidden inside, away from the outside world. Now, in the African American experience, there are particular resonances that that poem has that may not be there in other experiences, but that poem does have points that are viable for almost any experience. So I just wanted to point that out. I think those are interesting things about Chesnutt and Paul Laurence Dunbar, and I think that's it for my response for this week. Thanks.